Welcome to Sapru House. Before we start, may I request all of you to kindly turn off your mobile phones or put them on silent mode. We are delighted to have with us Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, who has served as Indian Ambassador to Jordan, Libya, and Malta. He is also a distinguished fellow at Vivekananda International Foundation. Ambassador Trigunayat will chair today's session. May we have you here on the dais, sir? So Ambassador Trigunayat would be chairing today's session on a panel discussion assessing implications of the US-Iran standoff. As panelists, we have with us Mr. Pramit Chaudhary, Foreign Affairs Editor, Hindustan Times, and Mr. Prabir Purkayastha, Editor-in-Chief of NewsClick, an online portal known for its very informed analysis on West Asian geopolitical issues. Maybe have you on the dais, sir. And then we also have my colleague, Dr. Stuti Banerjee, and myself as the two panelists in today's discussion. May I now request Ambassador Trigunayat to kindly conduct the proceedings. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'm indeed Director General ICWA. I'm grateful to you to invite us to conduct this panel and to discuss some of the very important issues that are confronting the world at this time. We have seen in the past few months that things have gone from bad to worse. We are hoping that there would not be a real confrontation. Seeing the fact that there are efforts on all sides to try and mitigate this disaster from happening. We have seen that the JCPOA, like any deal, was not the perfect deal. There will always be some actors who will not be happy with it, one way or the other. But at the end of the day, a deal is a deal that could bring about a possibility of a major country in the Middle East moving forward with the rest of the global community. And Iran came on board after many years of sanctions. But while we were discussing this during the Obama time, the candidate Trump just abhorred the deal. He declared during his time that he will not let this deal go on. He was not happy without it. There may be different reasons, we all can argue that. But as soon as he became the president, he showed his proclivities. Instead of going into the merits of the deal, whatever limited success it could achieve, they tried to have an expanding agenda. The goalposts started shifting from denuclearization to containing the ballistic missile capabilities, to containing the influence or to control the proxies of Iran in the region. Nobody can deny that Iran has expanded its influence in different parts of the Middle East. We have to see it in a perspective that there are existential threats and issues that have been nurtured over centuries between Saudi Arabia or Iran for that matter. There is a problem between Israel and Iran. They always do not recognize each other, rather obliterate the other from this earth. So there have been problems, but at the same time, the Arab Gulf countries also have been evolving in a very different direction. We have seen the new players coming into the Gulf with the blockade that happened against Qatar, saw the Turkey having a primacy, having a base in Doha, and at the same time we see the Iranian influence increasing in this, which was a welcome change for them. But at the same time, it decimated the capability of these countries to negotiate as a common platform. And what we see is that Israel has become far more friendlier with these countries, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Oman, Bahrain. And we have seen whatever is happening. We have been following those events, whether it is the deal of the century, whether it's the closer ties, including with Qatar, where the sports diplomacy is playing a very good role. At the same time, while there was Israel's angle mainly serves two purposes in this. One is that it could contain the Palestinian issue to some extent from falling out, could help the deal of the century once it is clear to everybody what it is actually. And secondly, to contain Iran in some ways. And now and they expected that US President Trump will do something. So President Trump took what he considers the best possible course of action. And that action is the maximalist pressure to bring them to the table. He does not want war, but at the same time he wanted to put so much pressure that they come to the negotiating table to recast this deal after having got out of it. They did not realize that Iran is not going to come to the table so quickly, and therefore we see this kind of crisis that has been emerging all over now. And we have seen, fortunately, the European Union countries continue to try to salvage the deal, even though Iranians are trying to follow a little more hardline policy, which they may have to come down and stop and reverse the enrichment that they have begun. And I read somewhere yesterday that their Atomic Energy Commission chairman said that they would be able to bring the enrichment to the US departure levels. So therefore, everybody wants this to go. Now, we are in a situation where if the war happens, then we are going to have the worst case scenario, which has not been seen, I think, after the Second World War. For India, it is going to be far more difficult because we are extremely dependent, not only for oil. Oil is 70% from there. You can always find some place where you can get the oil. The problem is going to be the diaspora. We have 8 million Indians, and in the case of a live war, it is going to be extremely difficult for us to manage that particular issue. Remittances is another small matter that the economy can handle. Of course, all these issues will have a very negative impact on the development of our economies. So what are we going to do about it? India has sent 2 ships to protect its trade and transit through the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman. They are doing that. But at the same time, our effort should be, and probably is, to somehow see that this war does not happen. And there is some kind of a modus vivendi, or at least a dialogue between the two sides. Now, everybody is working on it. Everybody is saying that there is no war. We are not going to have a war. Iranians saying only day before yesterday, Rouhani said that we are ready for the dialogue, provided the sanctions are lifted. So we have a situation where both sides are making. I have not seen any statement from the US in the last 2-3 days. Now you must see also the United States policy today is, of course, they don't want a war. But if they are pushed into it, they will go to, and which will be disastrous. But what is their policy is they are saying that it is your security. You must ensure your security yourself. US does not wish to be the arbiter of security anywhere in the world. This has been with Japan, with other countries, they have said you got to pay for it. And that is what they have told. There is a coalition of willing. They are asking the navies from different countries to pool in so that they can come and protect their lanes. They said, we are not going to protect your lanes for you. It is also possible now, for one simple reason, that US is no longer dependent on the Middle Eastern oil. But its partners, its allies are. And they have to protect their allies. But at the same time, the US also knows that if they move out of it, the countries like Russia that have acquired immense influence in the past since 2015, or China for that matter, which is very close to both Iran and also to Saudi Arabia, will benefit from it. So from the global context, they would like to contain that influence as well. What we are seeing the last is that Iraq has offered to conduct some kind of meeting, a dialogue between the two sides. It has been supported by Mogherini, the European Union foreign minister, so-called, and the French are taking a very active role in this process. Whole world, including the British, who are the closest to the Americans in that sense, even the so-called the new Prime Minister who is likely to be there, both our candidates have said that they would not like to go to the war in the Middle East. So that is a good consolation for us. But at the same time, how it is going to play out, we have to see. If it plays out in the negative sense, we have to prepare for it. And how do we prepare for it is what we are going to discuss today. What are the options? I am very happy that and honored that I have an excellent panel of experts and people who have worked a lot and who have tremendous inside knowledge and will be able to deliberate on it and discuss with us. But before I start, I would like to say that we may hear first presentation from Dr. Deepika Saraswat on how Iran has calculated its course of action that it is taking and how does she see that it is going to move forward.
Thank you, Chair. In my brief remarks, I will talk about Iranian positions in this standoff and the reactions and responses from the region. The US maximum pressure, which began about 2.5 months ago, is seen in Tehran as not just about renegotiating the nuclear deal, but also seen as an attempt to force Islamic Republic to fundamentally change its behavior, or in words of Secretary Pompeo, turn Iran into a normal state. The unprecedented US moves such as designating IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, as a foreign terrorist organization, effectively placing it in the category of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, has of course led to hardening of Iranian position and end of its year-long policy of what has been called strategic patience. Now, Iran's response to US maximum pressure has been to start using what Iranians are calling their own instruments of pressure. Iran's position that it will not be intimidated or coerced into submission is a sound realist reasoning, not a ideological position taken by the Islamist leadership. Because if Iran was to back down, the United States will only escalate its pressure and put a maximalist set of demands that it has been repeatedly talking about. So Iran's use of its own instruments of pressures, namely enriching and stockpiling uranium beyond deal's limits, together with the suspected attacks that have happened on oil shipping in Gulf of Oman, which the US has been blaming Iran for, have only led the US to further escalate its pressure, basically increasing its military presence in the Gulf and imposing additional sanctions. Now, the result has been what Mearsheimer, one of the known realist thinkers, has called in one of his recent pieces, is a classic escalatory spiral. Now, this spiral is dangerous because it might culminate into a US war with Iran or lead Iran to rush into developing its own nuclear weapon as the ultimate deterrent against the US threat. Second, we see in Iran there is increasing securitization of its domestic narrative about to work on the issue. The Turkish president added that one would have to focus on getting concrete results. Now, Turkey's cautious approach is understandable because in 2009, Turkey, along with Brazil, had tried to diffuse tensions over Iran's nuclear program when it actually offered to swap Iran's stockpile of low-enriched uranium for reactor fuel. But this exchange deal actually failed to assuage Western concerns about Iran's nuclear program. So Turkey has offered to mediate, but it remains cautious in taking any such diplomatic initiative. But Iraqi initiative, on the other hand, has received support from Europe. Visiting Iraq last week, EU's top diplomat Federica Mogherini articulated EU support for Iraqi proposal for regional conference. As as Europe tries to save this deal amid escalating tensions from pressure campaigns coming from both Iran and from the US, it will have to stay united on the issue, given that UK, while siding with the EU over sanctions on Iran, seem to be sharing US views on attacks on oil shipping, an issue that that my successive speakers will probably deal in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it seems that Russia has also, being a part of the deal, has been trying to prevail upon the Iranians not to go in for enrichment and breach the deal. And that has been the discussion. But what interesting comment that came from the French foreign minister was that a bad reaction to a bad decision, which was the US decision to withdraw from the deal and put sanctions in place. I'll request Mr. Pramit Pal Chaudhary to comment on the US positions now and how does he see this thing playing out.
Trying to predict or trying to see a pattern of behavior in the Trump administration is always a little difficult because we normally have at least 4 different foreign policies functioning at the same time in Washington. One is President Trump's own policy, which can be highly personalized and at times eccentric, but normally there's a certain method in his madness. Second is the White House itself, in other words, the people around him. And right now, given that the Pentagon doesn't have anybody who is really in charge, Pompeo is relatively weak as Secretary of State. The only real foreign policy player in the White House is John Bolton, the National Security Advisor. We then have the Washington establishment, which means the bureaucracy largely in the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, and in the State Department, many of whom are very hostile or not particularly unhappy with Trump's foreign policy in a number of areas. And then we have the U.S. Congress, which now increasingly, especially since the Democrats have taken over the lower house, run their own foreign policy, quite often independent of the White House and often in open defiance of the president. This results in very strange policies. For example, in the case of Russia, you have a president who is very enthusiastic about Russia, and as you go further down the line of the list I'd mentioned, you get to the U.S. Congress, which is deeply hostile to Russia and runs its own foreign policy in defiance of the president. In the Middle East, you have exactly a similar kind of breakup in which the president and definitely Bolton are the most hostile to Iran and the JCPOA as a whole. And then as you go further down the ladder, there's more and more support for JCPOA until you get down to the Democrats in the lower house who are violently in favor of JCPOA and want to resume, have America go back into the JCPOA as fast as possible. The problem, though, is but even Trump and Bolton have 2 very different views on how this works. Trump, as far as anybody can tell, the primary reason, and I repeat this, the primary reason he seems to dislike JCPOA is not because he understands the deal or cares about it, it's only because Barack Obama negotiated it, and his basic foreign policy principle is if Obama supported this or was behind that policy, then Trump as an individual must be opposed to it. Or at least, should we say, wishes to undermine that policy, if only to show that he can, either that Obama is wrong or that Trump can do something better than Obama did. Bolton, however, remains, as he has always been, intrinsically hostile to the Islamic revolutionary regime in Iran, and has been by far the most dedicated person or remains, I would argue, almost the only person really dedicated to the concept of regime change in Iran. And this is something that goes all the way back to his days in the George Bush administration. And he remains, as he has always been, a neoconservative, very dedicated to this principle that Iran's regime should be overthrown. Then you have the rest of the establishment, which I'd mentioned, which sees, I would argue, in the Pentagon and the State Department, remains of the view that the spread of Iranian power into Iraq, into Syria, into Lebanon, or has always been in Lebanon, remains as a major destabilizing force in the Middle East, and Iran should be pushed back from that, but does not support the concept of regime change. And there is more or less an alliance with at least with the UAE, to a lesser extent with Saudi Arabia. I think the Saudis are probably a little more interested in the possibility of regime change in Iran. And they're also closely aligned with the Israelis on this point, where the Israelis' view is more about the question of can we push back Iranian presence of Iran near the Levant area around Israel, rather than the issue of whether they can actually overthrow the regime, and of course where the nuclear arsenal of Iran then comes into play as well. So the Americans, therefore, as I said, run on several different paths, which makes the policy somewhat difficult to predict. This is not necessarily unusual in the United States. It's often seen as always foreign policy of several different agencies working sometimes with each other. But with Trump in charge, it's been unusually difficult because his own aides can very often have a difficult time trying to work out what their president wants. But one of the things I just pointed, and I'll speak about Trump in general. One, going back to what Ambassador Trigunayat mentioned, he more than anybody else is opposed to the idea of war. It's very important to realize that Trump's overall worldview, even when he was campaigning and continues, is that America has overcommitted itself to military postures around the world. He would like NATO to be broken up. He would like U.S. troops to withdraw from South Korea. He wants he's determined to get America out of Afghanistan. He sees these as a waste of money, a waste of, to some degree, lives. I don't think he's that worried about the lives part. He's worried about the money. He sees his allies as not contributing to this. He is probably, every time I go to Washington, I say, what country does Trump dislike the most? And the normal response is Germany, which is strange. The Germans themselves find this baffling because he's of German origin himself. Though he claims to be Swedish. He denies he's of German origin. He says, I'm Swedish, which is completely untrue. But he hates the Germans the most, and it baffles the Germans. It baffles everybody in Washington. But one of the key reasons is his belief that the Germans don't contribute enough to NATO and to the defense of the international order. There seems to be other reasons, but nobody can work them out. So this is his overall worldview. So more than anybody else, he is determined never to get into a war in the Middle East, where he sees as a particularly unproductive place for America to wage wars, and see this as a waste of money. I was talking to friends in the Republican Party once, and I said, what does he have against the war in Afghanistan? They said he's apparently worried about the fact that we're spending $50 billion a year there. Other than that, he doesn't really care. He has no strategic vision, doesn't really worry too much about the Taliban or the Islamic State. But $50 billion, he gets, wow, why are we spending that much money? So, therefore, Trump's worldview is extraordinarily simple. And this is one of the reasons why, that despite the shooting down of the Global Hawk, the American drone by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, the American system immediately preparing for at least a limited retaliation, Trump intervenes and says no, and makes a very bizarre excuse that he thought it was a mistake by the Iranians, that there was just one commander who was having fun with a missile and fired it by accident, which made no sense to anybody, including the Iranians, but it was very clear that he was determined not to have war. The people who do understand this, incidentally, are the Iranians themselves. And if you see the Iranian's foreign minister's statement in a number of places, he has said, the only man who wants to go to war with us is Mr. Bolton, and the one man who definitely doesn't want to go with Iran is Mr. Trump. And we can see this in the messages. The other interesting part about Trump is his basically narcissistic view that he can charm anybody in the world. All he has to do is meet them face to face. So he's done this in North Korea, where he and Kim Jong-un screamed abuse at each other all the way through the spring of last year. I remember I was in South Korea, and I met the vice foreign minister who said, told me, I think there's a 50% chance of war now. It's impossible that these two countries cannot walk apart because of the degree of abuse that is going on between the two leaders. Interestingly enough, the Chinese government officials I met also believed that there was a very strong chance of war, because they could not believe a U.S. president could walk back from the kind of abuse that Kim was giving to him. But Trump walked back and immediately had a summit. And this is something, again, when I talk to people in the Republican Party, they said Trump is basically a real estate developer. So his view is that yelling and shouting is perfectly normal in a business negotiation. What you need to do is give an exit ramp for the other side that results in the both of you sitting down and coming to an understanding. And he doesn't actually care if you abuse him. But he always offers the exit ramp. He offered it to Xi Jinping, he offered it to Kim, he's offered it to Rouhani. Even though Rouhani's a lame duck and everybody's saying it's a waste of time having a summit with him, he's saying, no, I'll talk with anybody. He's prepared to have a chat. He loves summits. He thinks he's a great summiteer. And as I said, he believes he can charm anybody. So this is a strange way that that plays in the United States right now, and the government of America, government officials of America always hold their head about their own president, trying to calculate when does he want the exit ramp, what type of exit ramp, and trying to stop him from getting on the exit ramp sometimes because they don't actually see any path that the ramp is going in any way. So Iran is also part of this strategy. He doesn't seem to differentiate between Iran, North Korea, Germany. They're all the same as far as he's concerned. And his real concern is only, can I be better than Obama? And he's perfectly possible, which is something people in Washington say, that he'll go back to JCPOA and tell the Iranians if he meets them in person, he'll even meet Ayatollah Khamenei and say, let's do JCPOA, but let's do a better JCPOA than Obama did, and then I'm with you. So this degree of uncertainty in the manner in which the president runs results obviously feeds down into the rest of the U.S. government system. But the one area that it's true that who do support him on the issue of at least not fighting is in fact the Democratic Party and most of the U.S. Congress, who fully support this idea that there is no reason to go to war with Iran and there's no basis for this. This is one of the reasons I tend to view the likelihood of war relatively minimal. However, because of the degree of uncertainty in the administrative structure, and right now the complete lack of leadership in the Pentagon, the possibility of an accidental conflict, not a major one, but at least one where you have a retaliation, a couple of strikes at each other, perfectly possible. The only other thing I'll mention about Trump, and this is something that's useful at least for India, Trump is obsessed with oil prices. He doesn't like oil prices to go high, and he's said this publicly a number of times. Why? Because his white working class drive SUVs and pickup trucks, and they're very sensitive to oil prices. And he's very clear on this. Whatever I do in the Middle East, it must not result in oil prices going up. And I will change that policy if that ever happens. So on everything that the Americans do, they always have to sit down and calculate, is this going to result in oil prices going up? Otherwise, we're not going to get the president's support. So they have to maintain this curious thing, which is one of the reasons why when India and the United States have talked about the situation in the Gulf, the Americans have made it very clear, price stability is something we guarantee because the president himself is the most allergic to the idea of volatile oil prices. It helps that the nature of the oil market has changed so dramatically right now that despite OPEC cutting production by 1.6 million barrels, Iran reducing its production by about half, and Venezuela going off the market, oil prices still have not risen. And in fact, in futures, you can actually see oil prices actually descending even further in the future. But this is another factor that the president worries about. It's a zero strategic issue, but it's one that's very important to him. And again, influences the manner in which the Americans play in the region.
Thank you. Thank you, Pramit. It was really very interesting. Now, as we know that it is going to have a lot of impact, what more can be done by all the other actors? We have seen that even within the Middle East itself, or the Gulf alone, Saudi Arabia has a very different position. Perhaps the Israelis would like some kind of an action taken immediately. But at the same time, the UAE is just pitching in for the dialogue throughout. Their foreign minister was here a week ago, and he also assured us that we do not think that there will be a war, and they are working on it. They have been talking to the Iranians, and this has been going on. So there are efforts going on even within the Gulf. The Kuwaitis are also speaking, the Omanis are speaking. So we know that things are happening. The Qatari Emir was in the US and they had discussions. Qatari foreign minister was there. So what we can do more, or the thing. And secondly, what are exactly the implications for India and what India should or can do? Well, I think that before I get into the specifics of what we can do, I think it's important for us to realize that there are three sides to the Iran-US standoff. There is Iran, there is the United States, and there's actually the rest of the world. And we are as, or should be as concerned about a possibility of a war between the United States and Iran, which will involve the region as a whole. And what happens to the rest of the world is, of course, going to depend on this war. I think you've already said, Ambassador Trigunayat has already said, that this will be a disastrous effect because about 20% of oil in the world comes from the choke point of Straits of Hormuz. That's about 30 to 35% of the tradable oil. It's actually even more. And if you add Bab el-Mandeb to the mix, you get an even larger amount of oil. We are talking of something like 35% to 40% of the oil, tradable oil in the world, being at risk. So it's something which the rest of the world should really think about, not just the white SUV driving, shall we say, class in the United States. I would also submit that what we lack at the moment is we don't see an exit ramp from what President Trump has done. I'm not going to go into his mental processes. Anybody's mental processes are difficult to fathom, and Mr. Trump may be even more difficult. But what we now see is how to walk back to an agreement doesn't seem very easy without losing face, and significantly losing face, particularly in an election year. At the same time, going to war in an election year also seems a disaster for Mr. Trump, but that's the kind of position he is in, having asked Iran essentially to surrender. Because if you take the condition that's been put by the United States, I'm not going to go into the details, but essentially it's asking Iran to give up its, shall we say, sovereignty itself. And that's something which I don't think a country of 80 million at the size of Iran is going to agree to. If you want to strangulate its economy, and here the issue is not just Iran and the United States. The fact is US can extend its sanction to other countries, and its extraterritorial sanctions, because it controls essentially the money markets of the world. That's what is making the difference. If it was just US sanctions, the world could go on. But at the moment, India is not buying oil. Turkey is finding it difficult. It's still, I don't know whether it is buying oil or not. 34,000. But again, it is going to face sanctions, economic sanctions of different kinds. That's what happened last time. So Halak Bank is under sanctions, and very heavy sanctions because of last time's what the US regards as sanction busting. But the extraterritorial sanctions of the United States is what has forced India and the European Union not to buy. And the fact remains that the INSTEX is virtually non-functional, and certainly no relief to Iran as far as Iran's oil is concerned. And I think that's the crux of the issue. Without that, you're going to strangulate the Iranian economy. Iran has therefore no stake, therefore, further in peace. Already Deepika has talked about what are Iran's options, but it is something on which I think sooner than later we might come to an unintended war. It's true, the United States, Mr. Trump may believe that they will not go to war. But, you know, the First World War did happen like this. So one shouldn't forget that war always does not happen because you intended it. The question that arises for countries like India, and we have a big stake in this, is that we, India, as well as the European Union, do not seem to have done much concretely except talking about something needs to be done. And if they're hoping that Trump will walk back to the deal, I think that is not going to happen without any further measure. So the real issue is, are they willing to talk to, shall we say, Iran and say, okay, we'll take some of your oil. That's the only way the JCPOA can be saved at the moment. If the European Union and countries like India join with Russia and China and make it possible for Iran
to export some oil, a significant part of which can then be used to also import things Iran really requires. If it does not, I do not see any exit ramp from a further escalation of tension, what Deepika called the escalatory spiral, and I do not see an off-ramp from the collision course on which President Trump has really has set the course with Iran. And I think that's the crux of the problem that we have. On the question of the JCPOA limits and so on, I think the US complaint to the IAEA is what is called chuspa, I believe, as a word, that this is the height of chuspa. You walk out of an agreement, then you complain that Iran is not sticking to the agreement, whose main contention was that at least it will relieve them of sanctions. $100 billion, I think, was seized as a part of this. They will get back that money and sanction will be eased. Now, full money has not been released as yet, and you've got further sanctions. And then you're asking, Iran is violating the JCPOA. Now, European Union has said this is not really right, but at the same time has said it's equidistant between both, as it were. The reality is that what does Iran do? As a part of the JCPOA, it had said, if you reimpose sanctions, particularly nuclear sanctions, there are certain things we will do. They seem to be observing that. They have not gone beyond the limits they promised as their response. And let's also understand what's happening. They had 10,000 kg of low enriched uranium when the agreement was signed. It's 300 kg, it's about 2% if you take the enrichment into account. They had enriched uranium of a significant amount, which is 20% enriched. It brought it down to 3.57. They, I think, dismantled about 2/3 of their centrifuges. They dismantled the reactors. Now you are asking them for further concessions. I think that's not really going to happen. So I think what the world, and this is already Ambassador Trigunayat has indicated, what is the impact on our economy. The problem is, India was a much weaker country, say at the time of the Korean War. It played a far more aggressive, shall we say, foreign policy role that it seems to be doing today. It claims to be one of the biggest economies of the world. Its economy is going to be badly hurt. Why is India's voice almost muted in the international affairs on an issue which really hits our economic interests so hard? I'm not able to understand it. It's very clear. Mr. Trump's all international relations are transactional. They are not geostrategic. They are not strategic. Therefore, its relations, United States relations with India, are clearly a transactional relationship. We might have thought that there is a strategic depth to this relationship. As the Afghanistan case has proved, there isn't any. We have been left high and dry. We thought that we will be able to intervene in Afghanistan. We had the Chabahar port as a part of it, and that was also the relationship that we are building with Iran. There is no Afghanistan role for India at the moment. So it is very clear that India has to take a position of strategic autonomy in its own interest if it wants to be a player, not only to be a player, just to safeguard its own interest. And if it doesn't do so, then we are going to be again and again blindsided with what international politics today is developing. So I think it's a very, very important warning bell to India's foreign policy establishment. The need to understand the reason for strategic autonomy, and if they do not exercise this strategic autonomy in the case of Iran, I think we are going to face further isolation and weakening of India's role. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabir. Thank you very much for that. In fact, if you remember that when last year we had President Rouhani who had come here, that time in the joint declaration that was signed, the Indian side reaffirmed its support for full and effective implementation of the JCPOA, which has been endorsed by the UN Security Council, and its crucial contribution to the non-proliferation framework and international peace, stability and security. Now that is what we had agreed, we had publicized, we had assured the Iranians. Thereafter, we know that as soon as when the waiver was removed, the Iranian foreign minister, Zarif, was here, and that time the election results were not out. And they were told probably that we'll revert afterwards as far as the purchases of oil were concerned. We have, I believe, given approval for one of the Iranian banks to operate out of here. We have the Rupee Riyal agreement which is there. So from the outset it looks like that India's, in this particular case currently, if you were to go only by last few weeks, that we have not made any major statement with regard to this. It's a good thing and a bad thing, but at the same time in the public view, I was talking to one ambassador today and she mentioned a very interesting thing. She said, in my country, when we were down and out and one of the ex-presidents ran away with a lot of money and everything, we were hoping that the countries that are going to come and help us when we are down and out and down there, then we remember them. At that time, India was not there. We had China, we had the Britain, the UK, and a couple of other countries. So, if in a difficult time, if you say you are a strategic partner, and that I say for the Americans also, if we are your strategic partners, you cannot take a decision that will hurt our economy and hurt our strategic interests. It's as simple as that. Same thing applies to if we say that the Iranians are our strategic partners, we need to do something about it. And if we think the Chabahar port is going to play a strategic role in our connectivity to the Central Asia and Afghanistan, then obviously it is an important thing that we are looking at. And just to peeve us, you know that a statement came out of Iran that perhaps they might connect Gwadar with Chabahar port or invite the Pakistanis to be there. But anyways, that is there. But I feel now personally that of course all relationships are transactional. There is no scope, whether it is with any country in the world. We cannot today call any relationship being what it used to be in the old Soviet era. That time you have buy of business is no longer there. And strategic word has much more used that is there. I would now request the last speaker, Dr. give her perspective on this very cantankerous issue that is facing all of us.
I'll look at try and answer why the US is trying to do what it is doing and somehow figure out what it gets out of making a mess out of the Middle East. So essentially for the United States, sanctions are a central part of what it is saying is the maximum pressure on Iran. And it is, I would say, did not really, in my opinion, it started last year when the first time it went ahead and withdrew from the JCPOA on 8th May. And thereafter you had Secretary Pompeo making his 12 demands on Iran, of which some of them, I'll just run through. Most of them are very similar, but one of them is that it needs to provide IAEA a full account of its prior military nuclear programs and terminate its military nuclear programs for perpetuity, stop enrichment, close its heavy water reactors and not have plutonium reprocessing, provide the IAEA unqualified access to all its sites across the country, end its ballistic missiles program and halt all development of nuclear-capable missile systems, release US citizens, allied citizens, and most importantly, end its support to terrorist groups, which according to the US are Hezbollah, Hamas, stop supporting the rebels in Yemen, stop supporting the rebels in Syria, etc. And once these demands were made, it is on these 12 demands that the US is asking that it will go back on renegotiating this deal with Iran. And it was sometime after that in August that the United States decided to apply sanctions once again, and on 6th November they decided to apply secondary sanctions on Iran, which is primarily the economic sanctions at its, in which it is targeting what was just said internationally. It is making sure that the unilateral sanctions, domestic sanctions in a way that the US has towards achieving its own national security goals become international. In the secondary sanctions, it essentially made that US citizens and businesses and entities would not be allowed to have any transactions with any individual or entities which were doing any kind of financial transactions with Iran. Now that essentially means that the rest of the world, if they do any kind of business with Iran, will not be able to do business with anything which has any linkage to US financial systems. So what you have is a system whereby the US is pushing the rest of the countries around the world to follow it on unilateral sanctions. These are not UN sanctions, these are US-led unilateral sanctions. Now these sanctions to some extent have had an effect on economic prosperity within Iran. They have reduced the sale of Iranian oil, they have to some extent dipped its currency. And there is a general, I would not say unrest, but there is a general pessimism within Iran as to its economic prosperity, how it would be looking at doing economic transactions with the international arena. And that to some extent has, I would say, the European Union is looking at how it can mitigate these effects. Because you have the European Union, Germany, France especially, you have France taking the lead on trying to President Macron trying to talk to President Trump, trying to get him not to withdraw from the deal in the initial. Now you have his political advisors going to Tehran and talking to them about ensuring that Iran stays in the deal. So France is making a huge effort. Germany is obviously making a huge effort. UK to a large extent has also made a huge effort in trying to ensure that this deal does not collapse. So for the moment, you have a deal in which one party has withdrawn. So essentially, technically, the deal still stands. Yes, there are issues as to whether it will be able to face the pressures and stay on the ground till the end of the year. So now you have this situation where you have everybody looking at this deal as one stabilizing factor, which was getting Iran into the international arena to more talks and more negotiations. But now you have President Trump who's withdrawn it, and in a way there is upheaval in the Middle East. So what I feel is some of the reasons that, in my understanding, as to why the US has gone ahead and done this is, one, as Mr. Chaudhary said, that President Trump basically does not like former President Obama. So there is this entire debate about how he needs to upend the legacy of Obama administration. And this you see not just in the Iran deal, you see it on the climate change issue, you see it on non-proliferation. So he essentially wants a Trump legacy. And to some extent, he wants this to be the outsider who came into becoming the president, actually making some policies which would have lasting effects. And that is going to be a lot truer if he does go ahead and become the president next year. You will have not just 4 years of President Trump's ideas and policies, you would have 8 years of it, which would be very difficult to go back on. So as of now, to go back to the JCPOA is very difficult, even if the Democrats come back. But if there is President Trump, then there has to be, you cannot go back to it at the end of the next 4 years, even as somehow the EU, Russia, and China make sure that Iran is able to, stay within this boundary and everything. The second is, to a large extent, there was a question mark on the JCPOA because President Obama was very much in support of it. There were negotiations for it, and you got to a point where you got Iran on the negotiating table, you got the US, and you got this deal. But he really did not have a lot of time to make sure it worked, and it came to a point that it could not be revoked by any other administration, which is a time factor that President Trump has if he decides to go into negotiations today with Iran. Because if you look at opinion polls in the US, there is a very high chance of him coming back into power next year. So irrespective of, even if he doesn't come, and there is another Republican president who comes into power, you will have a JCPOA that will be Republican Party oriented in the next 4 years. But apart from that, the fact is the Republican Party never really liked this deal. So they were just, you give the US, you have a president who has been vocal about not wanting this deal during his campaign, and he was vocal about it not being a good deal citizen. So he has to some extent gone ahead and justified his entire campaign by moving out of it. The administrative reasons for him pushing out of the deal are that by putting an economic sanction on Iran, he is going to essentially attain what has been a US objective, which is to ensure that Iran is not able to support the proxies in the Middle Eastern region. If Iran does not have the economic power, it therefore cannot provide the financial support to these other entities around, which is essential for US national security. And there is obviously a very marked pivot towards Israel and Saudi Arabia in this administration, which is also pushed by this desire to support the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen to ensure that there is more perspective on, and in terms of how Israel is looking at the region. Because if you look at President Trump's speech when he was withdrawing, he's alluding to Israeli investigations and Israel-led proof as to what Iran is doing. So there's very little support in terms of what the US was doing. So there are these issues for which the US feels that it needs to withdraw from. And one of the most other important issues is the ballistic missile development that Iran is doing. That has been an issue of contention. It was there even when the deal was being negotiated by Barack Obama, by the Democrats themselves. They felt that it did not address the future of ballistic missile development by Iran. There was these sunset clause, what happens after that. Now, the logic that was given was that you get this country onto the negotiating table, you get the ball rolling, and then later on, this is not just one agreement you're doing with them. You can take this forward, build your trust, and thereafter do more agreements where you can look at how both of you can curtail ballistic missile development, nuclear weapons, etc. So, in my opinion, these are some of the reasons as to why the US has decided at this particular moment under this precedent to move away from the JCPOA. And as was pointed out, he really thinks he can get a better deal because he believes that himself, that as he has been doing it in pushing other countries towards getting their 2% to defense in NATO, he would say he's got a lot of success with North Korea. He genuinely believes in himself that he can get a better deal in terms of how Iran will behave in the region. Now, it's a question mark whether the rest of the world and the rest of the leaders believe in it or not. For the moment, you have a president and his administration who genuinely believe in that. And to achieve that goal, they are actually weaponizing economic or financial sector internationally. And you now have a system in which, like I said, the international community is being forced to implement or follow US national security interests in terms of their own dealings with Iran. So will this, will we have new negotiations? As Deepika pointed out, Iran has indicated that it is willing to come to talks with the US if economic sanctions are removed. US is saying that it is willing to come to talks with Iran if it agrees to the 12 demands it has made. So I believe the EU is right now in a position where it is mediating between the two, trying to find out that middle ground where it can actually get these two people to come down to the table. Because Iran's escalation or the breach that it's doing is not something that it cannot reverse. I think that is something that the Iranians understand, that they are pushing little by little, but they are not really breaching the agreement, which would also get the EU sanctions to be applied on them. And that is something that the EU understands, that they have that little bit of leeway to push Iran and push the United States. But I do not see much progress in terms of if this negotiation or a new deal helps in the re-election process within the United States, then I feel that there would be a lot more progress towards any kind of negotiation. Because while Iran goes into re-elections, the US also goes into re-election, and you have the Democrats who are doing their debates. They have said they will come back to the deal. But you have the Republicans who are not agreeing. So depending on how the domestic politics in the United States shapes up, it is going to have a large effect on how the United States deals with Iran and the JCPOA in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we all hope that there will be some dialogue, some negotiations, and perhaps an Obama plus will come out. But as we know that there have been shifting goalposts in their demands, and this happens rather frequently. Now, 12 demands that Mr. Pompeo had listed out, some of those, as you mentioned, definitely are very, very difficult to comply with. And no country which has some respect for sovereignty and all that will comply with some of those. Some are in any case out of question or out of your real influence where you can guide everybody. Because one should always remember that any extremist elements, any country that nurtures, after a while they just cannot control it. It is a misguided, unguided missile thereafter, and it becomes a mercenary. So if that is the case to control it, I guess it is going to be very difficult. But now I'd like to leave the floor open, and before we close, I would request all the panelists to please tell one or two suggestions as to what India should be doing in these circumstances. First question. Yes, sir. Kindly identify yourself and the panelists that you would like to talk to.
My name is K. Subramanian. I was an IPS officer, 1963 batch. I worked in the Home Ministry for many years. I was recently in China, and the topic on which the Chinese wanted me to speak was how to improve India's cooperative relationship with China on the international sphere. I got the impression that our Chinese are very keen that India should be with them. I find that from the press, there are contradictory tendencies in the Ministry of External Affairs. On the one hand, the Foreign Secretary, who has now become the Foreign Minister, is supposed to be a Trojan horse for the Americans. At the same time, the Indian Prime Minister is increasingly friendly with the Russians and the Chinese. In fact, I think the Prime Minister has met the Chinese more than 14 times, Chinese President for more than 14 times. There is total confusion as to India, where India stands on this issue. It's very, very dangerous unless there is some clarity from the Prime Minister's side. Prime Minister has been is a very transactional Prime Minister, it appears, just like the American President. We have a strategic relationship with the Americans. At the same time, our Prime Minister is being increasingly friendly with the Chinese and the Russians. Where do we stand here? I think Prabir probably should answer this question.
But sir, let's not forget that today our Foreign Secretary was an ambassador to China, and so was our External Affairs Minister. And we have this Wuhan spirit which has actually been working quite well with the Chinese. And if at the leadership level things are moving reasonably well, I think the policy has been competition with cooperation. And there can be nothing more or less than that. But I'm not an expert on China, so I will, if anyone else in the panel can speak about it.
Should you want to answer, or should we take more questions?
One question.
Okay. Answering individuals what they should do is a very difficult task. I think we should answer what countries' policies should be and hope that the policy establishment really responds to that. Yes, I think we have a Prime Minister who has been very active on the foreign policy issues, but the country's foreign policy at the moment has both these aspects, containment of China as well as the Wuhan spirit. So just as you are, so as all of us confused about where we are going. It's very clear that we thought we will get much more importance in the American scheme of things. I think that part of the, shall we say, expectation has not been borne out. And with the recent Afghanistan negotiation that took place in Beijing, which we are effectively out, I think the fact that the US is willing immediately to jettison us in favor of getting their tail out of Afghanistan is also a lesson for us that we need to return to a more active international role. My problem is, by the time we do so, the Iran war, the US-Iran war may have already taken place, so it may be too late for us, and I think we are really running out of time. As I said, it's not my case that the President Trump wants war. It's not my case Iran wants war, or except Mr. Bolton, who probably does want war. I don't know if anybody else does really want war. But the point is that collision course that we have got on to, I think unless the rest of the world says let us buy Iranian oil, give them some breathing space. I don't see it very easy to get out of the collision that is likely to happen. That's my submission, and I think India has a big role to play in this because it's relatively a neutral power. It's not NATO, it's not a part of Russia, China military axis which is there. It's not in military ties with Iran. So I think it's really a country which can take a much more forthright position and say international relations demand that we observe international law, and putting sanctions on not only Iran but putting sanctions on other countries to have economic relations with Iran is in international law illegal. And that's, I think, we need to assert. Unfortunately, that voice is not coming, and that's, I think, really my worry, that if it doesn't, we are in much darker times.
Thank you. Other questions, please? Yes.
Hello. Good evening, panel. Thank you so much. My name is Anushka, and I handle public diplomacy for Global Youth India. My question is about what can be done now. So, whoever would like to answer it, thank you. Now, since there's a need to avoid war, should the United Kingdom, or has the United Kingdom been trying to push back US sanctions to guarantee security for certain companies or certain sectors?
UK.
Yes.
Well, they're holding the Grace 1 even today. Let's see.
Exactly.
Thank you. But, okay. Yes. Anybody?
So the UK, as far as I know, you have its foreign secretary already saying that you had the EU making a statement yesterday, which was UK, France and Germany, and I'm assuming they speak for the rest of the union as well when they say that they would like the JCPOA to continue and all parties to kind of take a break, sit down and just negotiate, because they feel that this entire escalation at some point is going to mean that the deal is going to collapse. So as far as I can make out, the UK as an individual country and apart from the EU as well would want this entire negotiation to happen for the JCPOA to continue to be part of it. And as far as the Grace 1 is concerned, it is not really a US thing that it is doing or anything else. It was a ship which they felt was in violation of EU sanctions against Syria. So that is why it has been held, and he said it that if Iran can give us some assurance that it was not going to Syria, it was not meant, they would let go of the ship. So Iran has also said that they would like to talk that out to ensure that the ship and its crew is free and safe. So that is a different thing that is happening between UK and Iran. I don't really think it's part of the larger JCPOA debate. It has just happened at a time when there is an escalation in the Strait of Hormuz. So that's my answer to you.
But UK obviously is trying to keep the JCPOA alive, and they have very clearly said, both the people contesting Jeremy Hunt and Johnson, that they are not going to support US in the war. That is their statement, which came yesterday only. So that much there, but I'm quite sure that something will happen. And as you know, there are a lot of saber rattling and a lot of statements coming out, but at the same time there are something going on underneath also, which is trying to keep the fuse from blowing. Right?
I just want to add a factual information. That was the 3rd of July, Gibraltar actually changed its law to accept the European Union sanctions and take action. And that's timing is very, very suspicious. So whether the UK is in control of its own policy, we don't know.
I also want to add a point, sir.
Yeah.
As far as UK is concerned, as one of the European signatories of the JCPOA, it seemed to be having a different position as compared to France and Germany. Like on the economic front, like putting in stakes together and circumventing US sanctions, it seemed to be going along with the other signatories. But militarily, like if you were to see the responses that came from United Kingdom after there were attacks on shipping, they seem to be buying more what the US allies are saying. Their statement was, we have to listen to what the assessment our US ally in the Washington are making. So I see a difference there.
Thank you.
Shri Prakash from the Academy of International Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia. I think that if you If you compare the situation now to the one that was there when Iraq was attacked by the United States in the Gulf War period, I think the US is in a far more unfavorable position because at that time you had the situation that Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and even many of the non-aligned countries were not, because there was a conflict between two non-aligned countries, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Now, Iran has done no such thing. The US has unilaterally taken the offensive to say Iran is a terrorist state virtually, because they've declared the Iranian National Guard as officially some kind of category of super terrorist organization. Sorry.
Cell phones are very dangerous.
So my point is that and the US military mobilization also is not on that scale that it is expecting to go to war. I mean, they have brought in some ships into the Persian Gulf area, but the sort of troop mobilization, President Trump is on record as saying that no, I'll send many more troops than just 120,000. But I mean, apart from having a Republic Day parade on the 4th of August, which he did, I don't think that there is any visible sign so far from the US military establishment that there is a huge kind of mobilization effort, which is there always before US goes to war, whether in Vietnam or Second World War, wherever you see it, is on the cards. So I mean, I don't know, these are kind of signs that there might be other political spin-offs from the situation that has been created. It's an election year in the United States, and President Trump says, my policy is make America great again. Not just that, and what better political stance to take than to say that US is the leading fighter against global terrorism, and here is the evidence. I'll go to the American people, ask for their votes on that basis. You see that we are doing fighting Islamic terrorism, since which goes back to 800 years as far as Islam and Christianity are concerned. So that aspect is also there in terms of the political mobilization effort. So maybe when we are talking about the accidental war situation, maybe this should be kept in mind. But the US is not in such a favorable position to go to war today as it was against Iraq in the Gulf War situation. That's my observation. Thank you.
I agree. I mean, your point is right to the extent that this time the real allies of US, essentially UK, the Europeans, the NATO per se, and the Gulf countries themselves, those who are going to be directly affected from it, are not in sync with a war-like situation. They want Iran to be contained and its influence reduced, but it doesn't seem like it. That is the only hope. But when we talk of accidental war, the First World War, how it happened, as mentioned, every time there is a situation. So if something happens, then there is a retaliatory action. But I was just reading somewhere that some of the assessment of the people who are military strategists is it will not be an all-out kind of a war. It could be a smart war. It could be a more cyber activity that would cripple the Iranian retaliatory aspects. So that kind of a situation you cannot rule out. Thank you.
Cyber war is definitely going
Yeah.
on.
It's already going on.
Yes, sir.
I have a comment really more than a question. I do agree that the situation is potentially very dangerous and the consequences will be not good for us, as indeed for many others. But I'm not sure what role there is for us. You see, we cannot imagine a role for ourselves and charge in because we think something of importance is happening. We have never been a factor in the Iran nuclear negotiations. The JCPOA was signed by Iran with P5+1. We were kept out of it. And there is a good reason why we were kept out of it, because the Iranians have been very suspicious about us where their nuclear issues are concerned, because they knew from the beginning that we were very, very concerned about the transfers which took place from Pakistan to Iran during the AQ Khan phase. Since then they have tried very hard to keep us out wherever something concerning their nuclear arrangements are concerned. Now, it is quite possible that now the Iranians are going around saying that please create space for us. We are in a very bad situation. And as I said, potentially it is a dangerous situation for every country in the region. But I'm not sure there's a role for us and we have to charge in blindfolded. So it's more a comment than a question.
Anybody?
Well, I think we should not forget our 2 votes in the IAEA, which also spoiled the relations between Iran.
After the HU Khan.
No, that's correct, but it was before the JCPOA.
Yes.
So therefore, there is also that history. I'm not getting into the pros, cons, and doing a balance sheet at the moment. I'm just saying that also should be put in the record. But I think the issue is not whether we should be nice and they should be nice to us. The issue is what is our self-interest at the moment and what is our self-interest in not having a war. So the question really is, can we rally the world, and I'm really saying this advisedly, that international relations should be not dictated by one country. Why is it happening today? It's because of the financial architecture, and that financial architecture, whether it's the SWIFT banking system, the dollar, the US law, which says if you would designate any contract in dollar terms, then you come under US law. This extension of the, shall we say, the extraterritoriality of the US laws is the one which is at the moment the crux of the issue, not US sanctions, not US walking out of the JCPOA. And I think that's a global architecture we need to talk about and address. If we don't, then I suspect that we'll have many more such issues, and some of it S-400. S-400 with Turkey or India. All of those are, I think, issues where we have to say each country has a right to take certain decisions, and the reason we cannot today is a global financial architecture which actually the United States control. I think that's the crux of the issue, and we cannot say that it's not a question of charging blindfolded into it. This is what we need to restructure, and yes, every country, and a country of India's size, can play a role in that. We have to. That's where I am coming from.
But I don't know if there was, perhaps you know about it, there was a possibility of India joining the P5+1 talks, but I think we did not join that. There was a proposal to do that.
It was not it was a good, I think it was a good judgment call. Well, it might be.
Yes, sir.
Sir, recently we have observed that the way India is playing its role, it's getting very undermined. The way in case of Afghanistan peace process, USA, Russia, China and Pakistan is playing a very pivotal role. India is left out. It's a, I think, very strange thing, and we claim that Indian foreign policy is very successful, and we hardly have any role where we should have a very pivotal role. So same in this case also. I don't think we are any stakeholders in this type of situations.
No, we are stakeholders definitely in this situation, but the role depends on the country, how much role it wants to take on. And that is in the judgment of the policymakers, to what extent they would like to go, and they consider whether participating or articulating a certain position is beneficial or keeping quiet is beneficial. I mean, those are the things they have to take. As far as Afghanistan is concerned, as we know, we have a position with regard to Taliban. An ambassador had gone there. So these are the people who are having Taliban talks, like with this Afghan situation with Russia, China, Pakistan and others are doing it. And so I don't think we are losing out. We should not say that we are losing out completely from the start. We have all the Afghans want you there all the time. I mean, from the top leadership down to the people, popular level. India holds that kind of a card, and I think it cannot be sidelined in the eventual outcome. But we have to see how this Taliban thing plays out, and I'm sure that we are looking at the possibility of where do we go with the Taliban itself, if they are going to eventually come, as Americans are in a rush to leave.
I think that Indians have not even been invited to the talks.
No, sir, because
They may not have gone.
yeah, I mean, because of the Taliban. Yes, sir.
K.V. Rajan. I would like to hear the panel on what is Israel's bottom line, and to what extent is that going to influence the possibility of an exit route, from a conflict situation?
Want me to say something, Pastor? Yeah, you want to say? You please go ahead, I'll just then sum up.
Yeah, Israel's position is very simple. That if it can get the US to destroy all its adversaries in the region, it would like to do so. The first was, of course, Iraq. The second, Syria. The third in this case is Iran. Iran is a biggie because it's really much bigger than Iran. The Hezbollah, they will not be able to use US very successfully over there because they have to destroy Lebanon, not Hezbollah. So unless they want to destroy Lebanon in order to destroy Hezbollah. So that's been their position. The only problem that exists at the moment, as Bibi, as Iran has called it, the B team, Bolton, Bibi and Bin Salman, that the B team at the moment, unfortunately Bibi is also facing a difficult election, and therefore you have all the three players actually in this scenario going in for elections at the moment. I will say Israel will fight Iran to the last American. I don't think they're going to put anybody of their side into the battlefield. And they're also very clear that a battle which brings in Hezbollah into an Israel-Hezbollah war may destroy completely Lebanon, but it will have huge repercussions for Israel as well, because they have about 100,000 rockets now on Israel, and if they take out the Dibona reactor, there is going to be huge consequences in Israel. Don't forget, Israel is a very small country. It takes a couple of hours to drive from one side of Israel to another. So people living in Delhi, it's smaller than the national capital region. So given all of that, I don't think Israel wants to go further into a war. But yes, I do believe that we are making a mistake about the nature of war today. United States will not occupy Iran, but it can effectively destroy Iran's economy. And if Iran cannot retaliate successfully to destroy what it has said, the oil installation in the region, then Iran would have lost completely. The fact there are 80 million people who will be then refugees from Iran is of no consequence to the United States, because they are the whole of the, shall we say, the ocean to protect them. The consequences for Asia and for Europe, it's not for them. So that's the asymmetric nature of, unfortunately, the US wars.
And sir, just 2 days ago, there is this Israeli Minister of Regional Cooperation, Hanegbi, Zachi Hanegbi, and he said that Israel is preparing for a possible military confrontation with Iran and its military wings in the next 2 years. So he says that the possibility that there will be a military confrontation with Iran or its military arms is more likely than the possibility that there will be no war. So that is coming out of their official, who is a security cabinet member as well. Yes, sir. Can you give the mic, please?
Thank you very much. Ahmed Jibril, Charge d'Affaires of Libya. Your Excellency, you mentioned 4 players in the decision-making process in the United States, and nonetheless you mentioned an individual's name, Mr. Bolton, and this leads us to question the role some other organizations playing, in particular AIPAC.
Which one?
This is associated with the last questions, the role of Israel and AIPAC.
Okay.
Yeah. So if we remember the most controversial decisions Trump administration took, all of them or most of them, related to Israel. The withdrawal from Human Rights Council, the moving of the American capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and the last one is the withdrawal of the Iranian agreement. So what is the role AIPAC and other similar organization is playing. And maybe this will lead to a question, to what extent the AIPAC and the Israeli would go on this, and to what extent also Mr. Trump will go to satisfy their demands, especially with the elections coming next year. Thank you.
Yeah. So AIPAC is the American-Israeli Political Action Committee. Yeah, let's put it this way. I would argue what the Republican Party has, anyway, the right wing of the Republican Party has always supported the idea of recognizing Jerusalem as the capital. It has always supported all of these policies, the Golan Heights policy. It has seen no reason why America's policy should be any way differentiated from that of let's say, the Likud party in Israel. What has held America back has been either that the Democrats obviously oppose this, but more importantly, State Department and the administration, the bureaucracy has argued that as long as America wishes to play a role in the peace process between the Arabs, between the Israelis and the Palestinians, we cannot take these positions. America has to remain a neutral player, or at least partially neutral, but something that the Palestinians are prepared to talk to. The key point about the Trump administration, he is not interested in being part of the peace process. Now, he's had his son-in-law produce a bizarre peace process which nobody's paying any attention to, and that's very Trumpian, but he himself is not interested in the Oslo peace process, and none of from Camp David onward, he's literally taken all of them and thrown them in the bin. So if you don't have any interest in America playing a role, and a real, genuine role in the peace process between the Palestinian and Israelis, then you immediately go to the Republican position. Then there's no reason for you not to accept Jerusalem as a capital, not to say that the Golan Heights is part of Israel, and to basically take the entire Likud position as America's position. And that's exactly what he's done. The bizarre thing that's going to happen is that if he loses the next election, America is going to go back on all of these positions, because the first thing any Democratic administration, and even possibly a mainstream Republican position, would be to roll back a large chunk of what he has done. I don't know if America would necessarily go back into the Palestinian peace process, because sadly for the Palestinians, nobody is interested in them anymore whatsoever, including in the Arab world. But within that, I don't get the impression that his policies are particular. Trump, again, doesn't have a very strong position on, his overall position on the Middle East is America should get out. He has an interest in Israel, but it's not even, I mean, when you ask the Israelis, they said yes, and our number one problem with the president right now, he's launched a trade war against Israel, because Israel has some $600 million trade surplus with the United States, and Trump has now gone after them, as he's gone after with us, and Japan, and South Korea, and the EU, and Mexico, and Canada, and anybody who he thinks has even $10 worth of extra trade with the United States. So the Israelis say, yeah, he's our friend, but he's also a bit nuts, and we don't know what to do about this trade war, because we don't buy, when there's not much we can buy from the United States. We're too small a country. So yes, it's there, but I would argue there's no broad strategic game in that. And even within even in the next election, keep in mind most of the Jews are going to vote Democrat. 70% of the Jews are horrified by Trump and are going to vote for the Democratic Party. And ironically, the only Jewish candidate, Bernie Sanders, is on the extreme left-wing, and the most anti-Israeli candidate in the US election is Jewish. So it's not exactly, I don't think in the election side the Jews are going to be a major issue, and I don't think they're going to vote for Trump, who they consider to be slightly off the wall on a number of issues. So on that, I have to say, I think that I'm not too worried about AIPAC's position or the AJC, which is much more moderate. The bigger problem, the larger issue, I think, when it comes to U.S.-Israel relations, is that Israel has moved so far right-wing. that the Likud, which used to be considered an extreme right-wing party, is now considered a centrist party in Israel. And the Labour Party and Meretz and all of the other relatively have almost disintegrated. They almost barely exist as a political institution. And that's, I think, a larger Israeli problem. But my sense is that it will eventually, if you look at the long-term, or should we say the medium-term history of the United States and Israel relationship, I would argue Israel has actually been losing influence in the United States. At one point there was an overall massive consensus within the American leadership that whatever Israel did was more or less what America should be following. You've now seen the entire Democratic Party is now more or less of the view that the Israelis have gone too far to the right for them to really work with. And you're now starting to see a chunk of the Republican mainstream also start to saying Israelis are getting a little too off the wall. Over time, I think the Israelis are slowly whittling down their political capital in Washington, and this is, I think, getting stronger and stronger. Trump is an exception to the rule rather than the rule we hope we'll see. But my sense is that you're starting to see a lot more of the American political system, especially as they lose interest in the Middle East as a whole, as to why exactly do we have this special relationship with Israel. And you have to remember, this special relationship in Israel only goes back to the 1970s. It's not a very old relationship. In 1962, the Israelis bombed an American warship, the USS Pueblo, and killed 50 or 60 Americans because they saw them as a threat when they were preparing for their attack on Egypt. So it's not a relationship that has a long history.
Thank you. Fascinating. There's last question, and there's a lady in the back. Yes, please.
I just had a small comment. When we talk about salvaging the JCPOA and withdrawal from the we have to also look at the role of the other partners in the agreement. Was Russia and China going in? How far is this? How far can we have a real hope of salvaging the JCPOA as far as coordinated policy coordination among the other partners of the JCPOA?
That's your question.
Like, as I mentioned in my remarks as well, as far as the remaining signatories are concerned, Russia and China, they are completely in support of keeping this agreement alive, and there are indications that China is buying oil from Iran. Russia, for all we know, may still be continuing with some kind of oil for goods kind of an arrangement that we don't get to know about. And then it has again indicated that if Instex doesn't, if it remains to be defunct as it is, they may want to help Iran with its oil exports and banking sector. So we see China and Russia, they are not working with the European signatories, but themselves, policy coordination, I understand your question is about policy coordination, but China and Russia actually want to hold Europeans accountable. They want to show that, you're basically dependent on the United States. You've not, even in 1 year, you've not been able to make this Instex thing work. So there they actually want to disparage European signatories rather than working along with them.
China is buying one. Yes.
Yeah.
No, even US
Iran
Russians have said that they will continue to buy whatever oil from Iran is concerned. I mean, not that they need it, but it's still just for a symbolic thing they are supporting. Of course, they have a very old relationship from the Soviet times with Iran, and it's been going on there. But at the same time, Europeans or what we say P5+1, at least all the P5 countries minus US have been interested in keeping this deal alive, and they are working on it, and that's why they are telling Iranians to somehow retract on this enrichment that they have started. And yesterday, as I said, that their Iranian Atomic Energy Agency has said that it can be retracted. So the hope is, and I think with this hope we can close the debate, that we will not see a threatening war that is there, and hopefully there will be some sense will prevail on all sides. and with the minimum damage to the region, to the whole international setup. Because I really shudder to think that if there was a real pervasive war, it will be the most disastrous war. And that's the most dismal scenario that we can even think of. I would like to thank all my panelists for their very considered and in-depth views about things. And we leave with the hope that we will not face this war. Thank you for once again.
I take this opportunity to thank Ambassador Trigunayat on behalf of the Indian Council of World Affairs. I thank him for his insightful comments and for moderating today's discussion. I would also like to thank Mr. Purkayastha and Mr. Chaudhary for contributing to today's discussion. Last and not the least, I thank all the esteemed audience for their valuable participation, and I request all of you to join us for refreshments at the foyer outside. Thank you.